It's Professor Buzzkill here. And of course, we are here with our favorite professor, Dr. Philip Nash from Penn State, here to talk about one of the most fascinating, one of the most impactful people in 20th century U.S. history. Professor, first of all, thanks for coming on the show. And then tell us who this person is.
Always a pleasure. Today we were going to talk about Joseph R. McCarthy Jr.
Joseph R. McCarthy Jr. I think he's starting to fade in public consciousness.
A little bit. I mean, he's because of some of the recent developments in American politics, I think he probably gets referred to a little, it's my sense, a little more often than maybe 10, 15 years ago. But yeah, he's not a household name the way he once was.
Whereas before, in the 60s and before, he was very well known.
Absolutely.
People still remembered him. Well, tell us, first of all, what's his background? Who was he? Where did he come from? Yada, yada, yada.
Right, the basic facts. So Joe McCarthy, born 1908 in Grand Chute, Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
His mother was an Irish immigrant, so he's second generation. His father was an Irish German born in the United States. They were farmers. He was the fifth of 7 kids.
All right.
He dropped out of junior high school at age 14 to help on the farm.
Oh, okay.
And only went back to high school at age 20 and then graduated in 1 year. So he got his high school diploma much later than most people. He enrolled in Marquette University between 1930 and 1935, earned a Bachelor of Laws, so basically an undergraduate legal degree.
Oh, right. Yeah, those used to exist in the U.S.
Used to be a thing. He was admitted to the bar and went into private practice. Clearly a very ambitious person from very early in his life.
But how does he enter public life?
Right, how does he enter public life? So he made an unsuccessful bid to become district attorney as a New Deal Democrat in 1936.
What?
Yeah.
I didn't know this.
So that would suggest a little bit of political opportunism in the long term. Maybe that's a little unfair. Let's just say that his political views changed over time. And by the way, and this is also partly just about good politics. Wisconsin in 1936 was very pro-Roosevelt. It had a very progressive past, right? This is the
Robert La Follette.
Well, Robert La Follette, the gas and water socialism in places like Milwaukee. It was a pretty liberal state back at the time. It was at the time beginning to shift to the right, and so that's going to explain. If you want to get into politics, you have to have a moist finger in the wind if you want to get elected. In 1939, he successfully ran to become a circuit judge. He was not, bust a mini myth, he was not the youngest in the state's history. He was young, but he was not the youngest.
Oh yeah, you often hear that. But
Yep, and there were some red flags in this first election that he won. He did engage in some lying about his opponent.
Mm.
More importantly, his opponent was old, incompetent, and complacent, and so McCarthy managed to unseat him. From what I read, he was an okay judge.
By the way, one thing, these circuit judges were very important in politics at this time, well, in the early part of American history as well, because you're literally traveling around to different courtrooms.
You are, absolutely.
You get known in other places.
Exactly. It is a good basis for a political career, even though it's not a political office. That's absolutely true. So he was very, very rapid in his handling of cases. It's possible that he was maybe a little too speedy in some of these cases, but he was also trying to reduce a backlog and apparently made some progress doing that. This is an important indicator to me, is that he was rarely reversed on appeal.
That's interesting.
So
That's
he may not have been the best judge, but obviously his work was good enough that he wasn't creating work for the judges up at the Court of Appeals.
Okay, we're getting up now to the beginnings of World War II, or beginnings of American involvement in World War II. What did he do?
Right. So he had a judicial exemption, which means as a judge, he did not have to serve if he didn't want to.
Because he's not that old.
No, he really isn't. No, the war breaks out, he's 33 years old,
right,
if my math is correct.
Right.
So he stepped down as judge and joins the United States Marine Corps in 1942, joining the military like a lot of other ambitious men.
Sure. Yeah.
If you're politically active, even some of them were ticket punchers, but a lot of our post-war politicians like Nixon and LBJ and John F. Kennedy, a lot of these people go into the military, even though they didn't have to, because they knew how important that was going to be for their careers. The fact that he had a college degree meant he was commissioned as a junior officer. That was normal in, I believe, all branches. So he was commissioned as a first lieutenant in the Marine Corps. He served in the Solomon Islands as an intelligence officer for a dive bomber squadron, so near places like Guadalcanal.
There's another famous person serving in the Solomons in this period.
In this period, that would be John F. Kennedy. Yeah. Absolutely, as a PT boat commander. McCarthy flew 12 missions as a tail gunner / observer in the Solomons. He was promoted to captain. His service was not terribly dangerous. There were, at the time and on the spot, there were half jokes about quote-unquote tail gunner Joe.
Oh, I thought this was real. I thought people were really
later
talking about
on.
it.
It became he sort of adopted it and went with it.
Oh, all
But
right.
at the time, it was like, oh, there goes Tail Gunner Joe. Like, ha, ha, ha. The guy who's sort of like riding along on missions.
Right,
That was
right,
my
right.
impression. Then later
Yeah.
on, it was adopted by him as a way of playing up his war service, which is what you did in post-war politics.
Because he could claim he was a tail gunner, even
Yes,
though
he
may
was.
have not have fired a shot in
So
anger.
the Larry Tye book that I've read and I'm basing this heavily on, and which will be on the Buzzkill bookshelf, he makes a really important point, which is, and he's sort of correcting the record. In lots of cases like this in McCarthy's early career and in his later career, what he does is he doesn't necessarily lie, but he embellishes.
Yeah.
So he'll take like a partial truth and blow it all out of proportion. And that's what you see in this case. So, for example, he flew 12 missions. We know that. He later inflated his mission tally to 32.
That's a big inflation.
It's a big inflation. That's a major embellishment, capital E, to qualify for the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal, where you had to have X number of missions to qualify. The Marine Corps actually granted these medals, the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal, granted them to him in 1952. He was a senator, but that's purely because of his clout.
You were supposed to be awarded those during the war.
Yes. But by the way, there are many, many cases, many of them legitimate, where someone is only awarded something long afterwards.
Oh,
when
I
they
see.
actually
Okay.
establish the record or find out the true story or find out an unknown story or whatever.
But this is not exactly legitimate.
No, not if he's close to tripling the number of missions he flew on. It's a real bad look. But it's telling too that in 1952 the Marine Corps is like, yeah, shut up and give him the medals, because by then he was a U.S. senator and very powerful, and you don't want to cross him. Even though I'm sure within the Marine Corps they're like, yeah, he doesn't deserve this.
Yeah. All right. Well, so then what happens after the war?
After the war, he returns to his judgeship and then ran in the Republican U.S. Senate primary in 1946, and he challenged the longtime incumbent, young Bob La Follette.
This presumably is the son of the Bob.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. And there were other La Follettes, and I often have difficulty keeping them straight. But this, remember, so he's a Republican, but he's a relatively liberal Republican when that was still a thing. So, and remember, this is not in the general election. So this is a Republican against a Republican. So McCarthy ran a ruthless campaign. He attacked La Follette for not serving during the war.
But wait, La Follette.
La Follette was 46 in 1941.
You don't want 46-year-olds in the
No,
military.
so that's a little unfair. And that's a case where you're just sort of relying on people's ignorance, right? Like they don't know how old he is. And so they think, oh, what a shame he didn't serve. What is he, a coward? He accused La Follette of war profiteering, which is something that McCarthy did too. I won't go into details.
All right.
McCarthy even got support of a leftist labor union because La Follette was an anti-communist.
Yeah. My jaw is dropping.
Yeah, it ought to, because basically it's like whatever sticks, you use, right? You attack him from the left, you attack him from the right, you do whatever. And if you're the head of a communist-led labor union in Wisconsin, you think, yeah, let's go with McCarthy. He's the better choice. Rather ironic. Young Bob also ran a poor campaign, and McCarthy won the primary. In the general election, McCarthy's timing was very good because 1946 was a Republican backlash year. This is where they took control of the House.
Which people thought would not happen.
Which would not happen. It only happened for that one term. The Democrats retook it in 1948. But this was a backlash year. Lots of people unhappy with Democrats, and he thumped his Democratic opponent.
Okay, so he's a new senator. How was he as a new senator?
So he was the youngest senator at the time.
Oh, right, yeah.
He's 38 years old. Right, that's extremely young.
Yeah, that's very young.
Senate. Most people build up their local and state political career a little bit more than he did.
Yeah, because he goes from judge to senator. He doesn't become a.
Yeah, he's not a mayor. He's not.
Yeah, right. Okay.
He's not a state rep. He's a pretty meteoric rise for sure. So he was in his early years in the Senate, by all accounts, super undistinguished and super unpopular. And he did some, in retrospect, rather questionable things. So, for example, in the Nuremberg trial episode, we mentioned the Malmedy massacre during the Battle of the Bulge, where
right.
about 86 American GIs were slaughtered by the Waffen-SS, the SS combat units. Some of those perpetrators were put on trial in this time period, and McCarthy came to their defense.
Wait, he comes to the defense of
yes,
Waffen-SS?
Yes, he claimed that this was a miscarriage of justice. We don't know exactly why he did this.
Huh.
It's possible he's pandering to German Americans in Wisconsin who exist in very, very large numbers. In fact, that's maybe not true now. It certainly was true then that no state had a larger percentage of people of German extraction than Wisconsin did. Wisconsin politicians often voted against entry into World War I. Yeah, partly because of this issue.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's also possible there's anti-Semitism involved. We don't know. For this and other reasons, the Senate press corps voted him the worst U.S. senator.
Wow.
At one point, yeah, and that's saying a lot. You look at the U.S. Senate circa 1950, there are some good candidates for that title, and he beat them all. Lots of people were speculating that he was not going to be reelected in 1952.
Okay, but obviously he turns things around.
Yeah. And so, by the way, I'm going to bust another mini myth because this is one that I believed. And this I've actually seen in at least one of the sort of television portrayals of this.
Yeah.
The idea that he literally sat down at a dinner with some cronies and they were trying to scheme for his campaign and they latched on to the anti-communism issue.
Oh,
It
okay.
apparently did not happen like that. He had already used anti-communism as an issue before this point.
Okay.
But what did happen, there was this famous speech, and by the way, we still don't have the text of this speech, I believe. He gave other speeches like it. There was a Republican women's organization in Wheeling, West Virginia,
Right.
where McCarthy spoke in February 1950. It's a pretty famous incident. This speech convinced him that anti-communism was a good issue to use. The reaction to it was
Right.
very favorable.
Okay. Okay. So he's kind of testing it out.
Exactly. And so, and this is at the same time, and it is in this speech, he claimed that he had a list of 205 communists who were currently employed by the State Department. And
We should remind. I love saying this on the show, on these shows, because Professor Nash, of course, provides these great outlines, and he said 205 communists, but it actually reads 205 Reds.
It's much fewer letters.
Well, because
And that's the term they would use at the time, by the way.
Exactly.
What are you, a red? Yeah.
Red. Yeah. Yeah. Now we think of red states as being it's completely different.
Right. So, but he made a very specific claim. I've got a list of 205 names of communists currently in the State Department.
By the way, did he wave a piece of paper around?
I don't know if he waved a piece of paper. He may have on another occasion have waved a piece of paper
Okay.
that didn't have on it what he thought he does. And by the way, that's also happened in our own time. It's a similar
Yes,
thing.
absolutely. Yeah.
Where look at this big stack of paper I have. No, they're all blank. But he had no list. He gave versions of the speech over the next weeks and months where the number would change.
Yeah.
And often, by the way, the origin of the particular number might have been number of problematic security investigations that weren't followed up on.
Oh.
In other words, that might generate a number, and then he would take that number and say, oh, these are the communists. And of course, it's possible that not a single one of them was a communist.
They could have been fascist. Yeah,
Exactly.
or anything.
Or maybe
nothing.
it was an unfair investigation,
Right,
or they
yeah.
didn't successfully defend themselves, or produce all the paperwork that the investigators were looking for. Right? There are a million different ways you might not complete your background check, but that becomes, oh, these are communists. Right? And this is very typical of his method, and he discovers that it's very, very useful. He had no list. The numbers, like I said, were basically distortions of dated material. But he quickly discovered that making the accusation was sufficient.
Now, this is a key point, not only in the politics at the time, but perhaps even worse politics now. The accusation is sufficient.
Oh, the accusation, if it is sensational enough,
Yeah.
it will get all the attention and everything else will just fade into the background. And in a way, it's impressive that there weren't more people who discovered this basic reality as thoroughly as he did. So, and by the way, very early on, the term McCarthyism is coined
As a smear.
as a smear, right? What he's doing, we're going to call that McCarthyism. So there were people who realized what his MO was and why it was bad at the time. But he also clearly, very quickly fell in love with the fame and the power he started to acquire because he was making these accusations.
Yeah, we never see this happening now.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Thank God we're behind that.
Lordy.
And we put it behind it. In the Senate, there was a tidings committee to investigate the charges that he was making. This was a subcommittee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that was put together to investigate the charges he made. Their highly partisan report, because it was a Democratic majority, blasted McCarthy's claims as baseless, but it didn't really matter. It's all about the accusations. And right, remember, this is in the broader context of the darkest years of the Cold War.
Right.
June 1950, the Korean War begins. It's a real dark time, and so he's got great soil to plant his seeds in for sure.
But the claims are baseless, but this being partly a highly partisan report, people are able to say, well.
Of course the Democrats are going to say that. Exactly.
right,
Exactly right. So that report didn't make a big splash, didn't get any traction. There were a few brave souls who took him on and would take him on, but his influence continued to grow after this.
We have to give the Buzzkillers a taste of this, perhaps the most famous brave soul who took him on.
Sure, and that's Margaret Chase Smith, who was a Republican senator from Maine. So she's not a Democrat. So and so I think it's called the Declaration of Conscience or something like that. By the way, it's including the one I'm using right now in my class. It's included in a lot of readers that are assigned to history classes. It's this real famous statement. It's very highly principled, basically saying that some holds are barred, basically.
Yeah, you
and
can't.
And in fighting the communists, we can't adopt their methods, essentially.
Right, which is exactly what he was doing.
One of the bravest men in the room was a woman, basically.
Right.
Because for the record, most Republican colleagues, even those who are privately condemning him, are publicly silent.
Lordy.
and go along with this. And so you're absolutely right. Margaret Shea Smith deserves a lot of credit for her principled stance, which also did not stop the McCarthy steamroller, by the
No,
way.
because he says his influence was growing. So
Continued to grow.
how and why was his influence growing?
Yeah, let me just lay this out because, explaining McCarthy I think is really important. There are lots of reasons for why his influence continued to grow despite his obviously problematic methods. So one, as I already mentioned, is the tenor of the times. Widespread fear of communism, and not only fear of communism, but a fear that the communists were winning the worldwide struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, 1949, the previous year, was a horrible year. That's the year that China fell to the communists. It was the year that the Soviets broke our atomic monopoly, right, in terms of they got their own atomic bomb.
Yeah.
We started to uncover some very highly ranked spies within the U.S. government. People like the Alger Hiss case was 1949, 1950. The Korean War was a stalemate, even though we went back and forth, but we were not winning. We plugged a lot of people.
So it can look like the free world is sort of losing or in danger of losing.
And McCarthy exploited that.
Yeah.
We have to explain why things are going so badly for us. And his explanation was it was treason.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, and you see that in today's politics too. You can still, people say in not so many words, we can never be defeated by our external enemies. Or we can only be defeated by ourselves. It's a very seductive argument.
Yeah, sure.
And sort of oddly attractive in a way. A lot of people believe that. And so a hunt for traitors seemed to be absolutely essential, and he seemed to be leading the hunt. And in this context, as I'm sure people are aware, when they think of McCarthyism, any past left-wing association, including, for example, during World War II, when a left-wing association was actually not necessarily a bad thing, and when, for example, Hollywood was pumping out these ridiculous pro-Soviet movies at government encouragement, or in the 30s when the New Deal was big, joining a left-wing labor union, that wasn't a bad thing.
No.
But now that could be held against you. And uncomfortable questions would face you, like, are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? So the Attorney General of the United States put together a formal list of suspicious organizations. And if you had anything to do with one of them, if you had friends who was on one of them, you could be hauled before a committee, you could be put under suspicion. I mean, it was a real dark time.
Yeah.
So my second point is, especially in this setting, democracy is especially vulnerable to a demagogue. Someone who gains power by stirring up, exploiting fears, and exploiting the prejudices of the crowd.
Again, does this ring bells?
Ring any bells? Yeah, absolutely. Thirdly, he was fed information. He had sympathetic leakers in the government. He had a lot of help from J. Edgar Hoover's FBI.
Again,
and I think this is often overlooked because keep in mind, circa 1950-51, J. Edgar Hoover answers to the Democratic president, Harry Truman.
Yeah.
And he is leaking information to the president's most vicious assailant.
Yeah.
So among the other many problems in J. Edgar Hoover's career is there's this episode here where he is basically fueling McCarthyism, and they're sharing information back and forth. It's a real problematic episode. It was also very quickly became very dangerous to cross him.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're wondering, like, why didn't more people stand up against this bully? Well, for example, if you were a major columnist like Drew Pearson, if you criticized McCarthy would come after you, and then your sponsors would start to disappear.
You'd be canceled.
Pretty much. And the minute sponsors start pulling out,
forget it. Yeah.
Then you're hearing from your editor and publisher, and like, you need to stop that, otherwise we're firing you. So it has a huge chilling effect. If you crossed him like Millard Tydings did, who was a Democratic senator from Maryland, McCarthy might show up and campaign against you when you're up for re-election, which is what happened in Maryland, right? In other words, a senator from Wisconsin shows up in your state, campaigning with your opponent.
Probably helped by the fact that it is Maryland. It's close to Washington.
Absolutely.
So,
and so he can easily do it physically. And so Tydings lost his election.
Wow.
And so he and other politicians lost apparently because of McCarthy's influence. By the way, that wasn't necessarily the case in an individual instance, but people believe that McCarthy had this kind of clout. Tydings probably lost for other reasons too. But McCarthy can claim, look, I went and campaigned against him, and he lost. And so other people say, well, I'm not going to go there, right? Why would I criticize McCarthy and risk my seat? And if you criticize McCarthy, you might also be accused of being a communist. Because who criticizes me? Communists do.
Reds, yeah.
He was also, in the same context, he raised a lot of money.
And
could spray it around to help other people's campaigns, which you see this in lots of careers like Lyndon Johnson.
Yeah.
Who becomes a major player in the House of Representatives, around 1941, because people notice that he's got a lot of money at his disposal.
Yeah.
In his case, Texas oil money. The Republican Party is also part of this context. Let's keep in mind, just for the record, going into 1952, the Democrats have controlled the White House for 20 straight years.
Yeah, that's astounding.
They've won. That doesn't happen these days.
No.
It'll probably never happen again. 5 straight presidential elections, 32, 36, 40, 44, and 48. So the Republicans are. So if you're wondering why would an otherwise upstanding Republican put up with someone like McCarthy and their party, part of the answer is their desperation. They were willing to tolerate a particularly vicious attack dog because he's their cutting edge in their return to power, or potentially. He did the dirty work. It allows a more reputable senator to say, well, I disapprove of the senator's methods, while privately saying, go Joe.
Because he's that first senator's getting benefit from
and
it.
And you don't have to order him. He's a self-starter. He's doing this on his own. If he gets really out of hand, you can just cut him loose. And in the meantime, he's doing the important work of tearing down Democrats. So another factor, so this would be my number 6 factor, is the press. McCarthy becomes very skilled at manipulating it. We see it all the time in our current situation today. The press is easily manipulated. He's very clever playing with things like deadlines. So he would do things like...
this is interesting.
So like tactically, he would do things like hold a press conference just before the filing deadline of reporters working for newspapers. So let's say the deadline's, 5 p.m.
Yeah.
If you want your story to appear in the newspaper the next day, you have to file your story by 5 p.m. Hold a press conference at 4:15.
Yeah.
And make some scurrilous charge. And the reporters jot it down. Now you're the reporter and you have a choice. You can go fact check it and risk getting scooped. Because if you fact check it, you might not get your story in on time. And then you're yesterday's news.
Lordy.
Or you can go ahead and run the story and pray that it's true.
Yeah.
And most reporters will do the latter.
Yeah.
So then McCarthy's claim gets the press, gets the headline, gets the front page. And you know how the newspapers, they still do this. If it turns out to be BS, a week later, there'll be this tiny little box buried on page 17 for the record.
Which nobody reads.
Which no one will read.
Yep.
But McCarthy understands that basic dynamic. He understands the nature of the news business, and he plays it beautifully. He understands that reporters are ambitious too. There are also friendly newspapers. There are Republican-leaning newspapers who are happy to do this. There's also, I was interested in learning this, a big role was played by the wire services.
Okay, now let's remind the buzzkillers what the wire services were,
right?
Because this is a long time ago.
Sure. Reporters don't just like New York Times reporter or Washington Post reporter. There are also wire services like United Press International, or today the Associated Press is still a wire service. Back then, there were more of them. There were like some international news service. There were others. And these are the people who, they put out these sort of short generic stories that get picked up by all sorts of newspapers that don't have their own reporters.
Right.
So
Regional
a lot
papers.
Right.
Yeah.
So a lot of the daily news you get is done by these, they're almost faceless. It's not about the byline. It's not about this famous reporter is on the story. It's just, this is the AP or this is the UPI. A lot of these wire service reporters, they're not so great. They're not so great at their jobs. They don't have the time to fact check. They don't have the resources to dig deep and do major stories. There's fierce competition among them. And so a lot of them are the most vulnerable to McCarthy's tactics. And that's how a lot of his misinformation gets put out there.
How does this fit into this context of the times in terms of politics and journalism?
Yeah, my final point is sort of explaining him at probably too great a length, is that this was nothing new.
Yeah.
We had demagogues in the American past. Just think of someone like Huey Long, and I'd love to do a show about him someday. He deserves his own show. The flaws of the press were not new. Anti-communism was not new.
No,
the House Un-American Activities Committee was very, very active in 1947, investigating Hollywood and the Hollywood 10 and all that. By the way, very good movie on this subject called Trumbo, where
Trumbo,
Bryan Cranston played. I recommend that movie. And that's years before McCarthy latches on to the anti-communism issue. I would describe him as this. McCarthy is just more skilled, more prominent, more destructive as a practitioner. But the idea, the trend, the methods, those were all already there. He just sort of assembled them into one particularly effective package. And Democrats basically struggled and failed to respond. They really had no answer. They tried, but they failed.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Now, Professor, we're going to take a break for our corporate overlords to help fund the Buzzkill billions. But when we get back, we'll be able to talk about, we're now getting up to the point where he's up for re-election and stuff like that in 52. So more with Professor Nash and Joe McCarthy after this quick break. All right, Buzzkillers, we're back with your favorite Buzzkiller, Professor Philip Nash from Penn State. We're talking about Joe McCarthy, one of the most famous American politicians of the 20th century, one of the most problematic people in all of American history, I would say. We got to the point where he's more or less vaulted into this incredibly powerful role by the early 50s. Now he's up for re-election in 52, right?
Yes. Yeah, this is the end of his first term, so he's up for re-election. Once again, his timing's good. He's running in 52. Top of the Republican ticket is Dwight Eisenhower, the great war hero. McCarthy, like I said, is still the cutting edge of the Republican drive for taking the White House. He savages the Truman administration. He throws around phrases like 20 years of treason.
How is this possible? That means he's calling FDR traitor.
Yep. Well, keep in mind that a lot of his, and I didn't talk about this, even back in his Wheeling speech, A lot of what he's doing is basically class warfare.
Ah.
In other words, it's not so much anti-communist as anti-liberal, and you smear liberals as, there's this one speech where he says, the people who've been selling us down the river are the very best. The people born with silver spoons in their mouths, right? There's and he's very, obviously very sort of lower or working class. He's appealing to, it's populist demagoguery. How do you appeal to the working and middle class? Is that you attack the upper class, you attack the Ivy Leaguers, you attack the Dean Achesons, the people in the pinstripe suits. It's one of the reasons why the State Department becomes such a good target.
Yeah, actually, that's extremely important.
Yeah.
The State Department is really an old boys
elitist,
Ivy League.
The Republicans would complain about Dean Acheson with his fake British accent.
Yeah.
There's a lot of this sort of cultural baggage that they exploit very, very well. And the New Deal did actually harbor some people who are on the extreme left.
Yes, that's right.
And were essentially communist sympathizers. So they did have some material to work with when they make this charge of 20 years of treason. In the 52 campaign, however, McCarthy also calls George C. Marshall a traitor.
Now, really, good God. Good God almighty.
Yeah. So George C. Marshall, who was, of course, apart from FDR, probably the single man most responsible for our World War II victory. I mean, nothing less than that. I'm pretty sure that I'm right in this. Marshall was sent to China to help in 45, 46. He went on a mission to China to help iron out the civil war there and failed. No one could have succeeded. And so they would blame him for helping deliver China to the communists.
Is that where the losing China thing comes
Absolutely.
in? Okay.
Yeah, and remember that, like I said, that was a shock of 49. That's one of the reasons why Democrats are unpopular, because it seems like we're losing the Cold War because of them. And McCarthy, of course, is willing to carry that charge forward.
Yeah, I say losing China, buzzkill, is because
quote unquote,
quote unquote, because that was the phrase that we used. The Democrats lost China on and on and on.
And that, by the way, that's going to help get us into Vietnam because because politicians like Kennedy and Johnson were around at the time when we quote unquote lost China, and they were terrified that it was going to happen to them too.
Yeah,
and so that's why you send troops into a place like Vietnam. So Eisenhower very awkwardly campaigned with McCarthy in Wisconsin. This, by the way, is a notorious episode in Eisenhower's biography. His biographers write about this quite a bit. He wanted to defend Marshall, who after all was his boss and his hero in some ways.
Oh, yeah.
But he agreed to cut out part of a speech where he came to Marshall's defense. And he always regretted it later.
Oh, yeah.
It was a real low point for Eisenhower. By the way, you can find it on, certainly it's in one of the biographies. There's a photograph from the time of Eisenhower and McCarthy. I think they're both alone in, or like they shake hands or something. They meet on the campaign trail, and you can tell it's awkward.
We should remind buzzkillers that one of the reasons Eisenhower runs for the Republican nomination in 52 is to stop the party from going way to the right.
Correct.
Along the Robert Taft lines.
Exactly, especially on isolationism. Yes.
And to tamp down this McCarthy streak.
Correct.
So the fact that he has to deal with him is extremely problematic.
But part of my point here also that there was cowardice all around, including in the Eisenhower camp and with Dwight Eisenhower himself, which is not a really good look. So McCarthy was soundly reelected. He got 54.2% of the vote. But interestingly, he badly trailed Eisenhower in Wisconsin.
Yeah, right.
So Eisenhower got a lot more votes in Wisconsin than McCarthy did, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
Now, going into 1953, the Republican Party now has the Senate majority because they won it in the 1952 election. They didn't just win the White House.
Now, this is a big deal. This really mattered.
This matters because what this means is that in the Senate, the Republicans run the committees. He was made chair of the Committee on Government Operations.
Mm-hmm.
He was denied the Internal Security Subcommittee, sometimes known as the McCarran Committee. And that was Pat McCarran, a Democrat, but an unbelievable nut job on the anti-communist right, even though he was a Democrat. I'm happy to report that the Las Vegas airport is no longer named after Pat McCarran.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
You changed it?
Yeah,
okay.
Not 2021. Yeah, it's now the Harry Reid Airport.
Okay.
Big step forward. If you know anything about Pat McCarran, people should go look him up. Unhinged anti-communist. It was what should be attached to Pat McCarran. So in other words, the Republicans are trying to contain him. The problem was that the Government Operations Committee also had a permanent subcommittee on investigations.
Yeah.
Permanent subcommittee on investigations, which sounds kind of vague.
Yeah, yeah.
And he could now use that to hunt for communists.
Ah.
So 53 really is an important change. So he's obviously very prominent, very powerful before this, but now he actually has a tool of government he can use to further extend his crusade. His fatal error was that he didn't really recognize that the Republicans now control the White House.
Yeah, he can't lash out at the White House.
Doing what you were doing is fine as long as Democrats are in power. But now There's a Republican in the White House. And as far as I can tell, his problem by this point is that his ego and his addiction to fame and power are now out of control. They've taken over, and in some ways, even more importantly, he's come to believe his own hype. Even if at some point, or to some extent, his anti-communist crusade was sort of this cynical exercise for maintaining or acquiring power, he now, by 1953, from everything I've seen, he truly believes that only he can fix it. That only he can save the country from the communist scourge.
Okay, look, Professor, may we stop here? You know how much I love you. You know how much you mean to the show, but you can't give me this great outline that says only he can save the country from the Reds, and then vocalize it as only he can save the country from the
I'm trying to clean up my own shorthand.
Can we please stick with Reds?
The Reds, yes. Only he can lead the charge against the Reds, or can prosecute the Red Hunt. The chief Red Hunter. By the way, I don't know, this is not terribly on point, but 1952 was the year that Hollywood put out a movie called Big Jim McClain. John Wayne plays a House Un-American Activities Committee investigator chasing Reds in Hawaii.
I've never heard of this.
I've actually seen a few minutes of it. It's bad. but yeah, apparently there were all sorts of commies in Hawaii circa 1952. And thank God John Wayne is on the case. Yeah, wow. Big Jim McClain. You should go look it up. It tells you everything you need to know about that time period. Anyway, by the way, he even gets to the point where he's now using the phrase 21 years of treason.
But that would include...
That would include
Eisenhower.
1 year of Republican rule. Yeah, correct.
Yeah.
You got my point. Yeah, if it's 52 and you say 20 years of treason, everyone gets it. You're talking about the Democrats. But now it's like, wait a minute, y'all are in charge. Like, what? So there's still traitors? With his subcommittee, he really abuses his power. He bullies witnesses. He helps destroy some careers. And, you can always, once again, half full, half empty. The worst years of the McCarthy at witch hunts, we didn't become the Soviet Union. This wasn't this overbearing police state. You still basically enjoyed your rights. We weren't lining up people and shooting them for accused of being communists. However, that's also setting the bar a little low. Right?
Yeah.
I'd like to think we are not just a little bit better than the Soviet Union, but a lot better than the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And this is a time when you were not free to speak your mind, where there was a huge chilling effect. People stopped criticizing American society. Hollywood certainly did. You didn't see a lot of social issue movies because people are terrified of being accused of being communists. There were all sorts of teachers who lost their jobs because they refused to take federal loyalty oaths. There were a few suicides. There was a blacklist.
Yeah.
In lots of industries. I mean, it was a dark time. And by the way, you also had McCarthy imitators at the state and local level.
Oh, my God.
In California, where I'm from, there was a CUAC. There was the California Un-American Activities Committee. I mean, this multiplied. Lots of people jumped on this McCarthy bandwagon. And so it really was widespread and extremely pernicious. Now he really gets going because he has this permanent subcommittee on investigations.
Okay, now, at what point do people start pushing back? He's been in the Senate now for... Well, he's second term.
Second term, correct.
So do people eventually start pushing back?
Yeah, well, and by the way, and I mentioned him a minute ago, I'll just repeat it. There were always a few people who were willing to take him on. I was surprised to learn this in my own research. In the 52 campaign, the Henry Luce publications, like Time and Life, they criticized McCarthy.
Now, that's a big deal.
That's a huge deal because he was a huge Republican.
And you can't get more establishment than that.
And then at one point, by the way, he backed off a bit because of sponsors, but then he went after him again. And actually referred to him as a demagogue before the 52 election. So, I mean, Henry Luce, I'm not a huge fan, but Henry Luce could do it. And some other people did it too. But certainly after 53, there are a few people who step up. Most notably, Edward R. Murrow, the great reporter from World War II.
People will sort of know this story, I think.
Yeah, he had his show called See It Now, and he went after McCarthy, in some ways hanged McCarthy with his own words, in March 1954. So this was still pretty early. This was risky. And if people haven't seen it, they should go see it. It's a short movie. It's only 90 minutes long. That's the George Clooney movie called Good Night and Good Luck.
Right.
Highly recommend it. Terrific history, terrific movie. Really captures the time period and what some of the risks were in the context of the media world at that time. What was involved in taking on McCarthy. It's really well done.
Murrow is played by that great actor, totally underrated, David Strathern.
Correct, absolutely. No, and the movie's in black and white, which is also
it's cool. Yeah.
But no, if people haven't seen it, they should. It's a little older now, but great movie. I show that to students sometimes. So that started to weaken him. Because that Edward R. Murrow. Sterling reputation.
Above suspicion.
Totally above suspicion. A lot of people start to ask questions about McCarthy. Eisenhower, now he has the power of the White House. What is Eisenhower doing? My answer is not much. Eisenhower refused to confront McCarthy directly. At one point, he privately said, I refuse to get down in the gutter with that guy. That was sort of Eisenhower's approach. Eisenhower's much more of a consensus builder in any way, just as just general MO in politics. The best thing you could say about Eisenhower is that he allowed McCarthy to self-destruct. And it's part of this, in political science and history, they talk about the hidden hand thesis, where they talk about, since the 1980s, they talk about Eisenhower, the idea that he has this sort of useless, bumbling facade, but beneath it, he's actually a very sort of cold, calculated, hands-on president. There's a lot to that argument, by the way. My problem in this case is, okay, so you're not doing anything, but you're working behind the scenes and allowing McCarthy to self-destruct. My question is, what if McCarthy doesn't cooperate and self-destruct? Then what? In other words, McCarthy is so pernicious, he needs to be taken down now, and the hidden hand, go slow, consensus-building approach isn't appropriate for a threat of this magnitude. That would be my Monday morning quarterbacking. The question is, how much damage is McCarthy going to cause in the meantime?
Because he's already inflicted a huge amount of damage, and people have committed suicide.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in political terms, he's still this sort of Tasmanian devil spinning through Washington, D.C., crushing everything in his path, or at least damaging it. So he investigates the Voice of America.
That's like saying that the Voice of America is the red commissariat for media information.
He investigates the International Information Agency, and then he turns his sights on the U.S. Army. Which, in terms of political tactics, let's see. We have one of the greatest war heroes of the 20th century is now in the White House, and he's a career Army officer. Do you think that's a good idea, going after the Army? Now, by the way, if he had gone after the Navy, it probably would have blown up in his face. In any case, he claimed that a particular Army dentist was a communist.
Dentist?
The Army does have doctors and dentists.
No, I know that, but that's kind of, you're really reaching. If
I agree. Right? What's he going to do? Give communist-style root canals or something? But anyway, so there was this. What was his name? Last name was Prentice, I believe. So there was an Army dentist who had a questionable background, at least according to McCarthy, and yet he hadn't lost his job. And so then McCarthy's like, "Who's protecting this guy? Are there communists in the Army?" So the Army then retaliated by accusing McCarthy and his chief counsel, Roy Cohn, of...
by the way, who we've done a piece
we've done a POS on Roy Cohn, maybe even the first one, or one of the early ones for sure. Anyway, by the way, one of the political tutors of Donald Trump later on. Let's not forget that. But so McCarthy's chief counsel was a young attorney named Roy Cohn, and the Army accused McCarthy and Cohn of pulling strings to get favorable treatment for another McCarthy assistant by the name of G. David Schein. Who, if anyone knows, you should look into him. He's a fascinating character, not in a good way, but he was sort of a unpaid counsel for McCarthy's staff. And they had clearly pulled strings to get him out, to get him an easy sort of cush service in the military, etc. He was a former aide who's now in the Army.
This leads me to something called the Army McCarthy hearings. Everyone, well, not everyone, but lots of people have heard of that. A lot of people haven't heard the details. So what were the hearings really about? I haven't
seen all of it. Way back when they made a documentary about this, I think it's called Point of Order. Have you ever heard of this?
I can't remember.
Anyway, so these were actually famous for years after. So-called Army McCarthy hearings. So these occur between April and June 1954, where charges and countercharges are aired in his committee. He had to recuse himself because he was party to this dispute. So he wasn't actually running his committee at the time. It was given to someone of this other senator. I think it's Carl Munt of Tennessee who's running the committee. McCarthy's there. He's there with his staff and everything, but he's not actually running the committee. And these, most importantly, and this is a landmark in the history of political television, these hearings were televised live.
This is mid-1954.
Mid-1954. Millions, not thousands, millions of Americans watched these on television.
Yeah.
And, people typically don't hang out and watch C-SPAN these days. At least not in large numbers. But it's context. This is early in the history of television. And you did not, as an average American not in Washington, D.C., you did not have the opportunity to watch live American politics. And so it was fascinating.
And there wasn't a lot on else.
Correct.
But also, this is the same with the Watergate hearings.
Correct.
People watched that.
And because it was dramatic. For sure. Now, the hearings themselves were inconclusive. But really, for the first time, many viewers, millions of Americans, saw McCarthy for what he was for the first time. In other words, a snide, condescending bully. Which through the mediation of print media, you don't catch. Print media, particularly in his case, has a way of sort of cleaning him up. You quote him, you don't get any sense of tone. You don't know what's going on in the executive session of his subcommittee, right? You don't know how he is. And yet when you see him, it's like, oh, wow, he's really kind of an ass. And that was the conclusion a lot of people came to. And now it helped that he was taken down on live television by the Army Counsel, Joseph Welch, who famously said, "Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last?" Right? It's this famous quotation. And I've read accounts where right after, there was actually a point where Welch says, "Can we move on?" And then everyone applauds.
Yeah.
And I think McCarthy, like in an aside, said, "What did I do?" Basically didn't know what hit him. Had he been taken down?
Yeah, let's play that clip for the Buzzkillers, and you'll get to see this context for why Joseph Welch says this.
Mr. Chairman, may I say that Mr. Welch talks about this being cruel and reckless. He was just baiting. He has been baiting Mr. Cohen here for hours, requesting that Mr. Cohen, before sundown, get out of any department of the government anyone who is serving the communist cause. Now, I just give this man's record, and I want to say, Mr. Welch, that it has been labeled long before he became a member, as early as 1944.
Senator, may we not drop this? We know he belongs to the Lawyers Guild. And Mr. Cohen nods his head at me. I did you, I think, no personal injury, Mr. Cohen.
No, sir.
I meant to do you no personal injury. And if I did, I beg your pardon. Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
I know this hurts you, Mr. Welch.
I'll say it
may
hurts.
I say, Mr. Chairman, as a point of personal privilege, I'd like to finish this.
Senator, I think it hurts you too, sir.
I'd like to finish this. I know Mr. Cohen would rather not have me go into this. I intend to, however, and Mr. Welch talks about any sense of decency. It seems that Mr. Welch is pained so deeply, he thinks it's improper for me to give the record, the Communist Front record, of the man whom he wanted to foist upon this committee. But it doesn't pain him at all. There's no pain in his chest about the attempt to destroy the reputation and take the jobs away from the young men who are working on my committee. And Mr. Welch, if I have said anything here which is untrue, then tell me. I have heard you and everyone else talk so much about laying the truth upon the table that when I heard it completely phony, Mr. Welch, I've listened to you now for a long time, to saying now before sundown you must get these people out of government. So that I just want to have it very clear that you were not so serious about that when you tried to recommend this man for this committee. But the point is, Mr.
Chair, I would like to say again that he does not believe Mr. Welch recommended Mr. Fisher as counsel for this committee because he had, through his office, all the recommendations which were made and does not recall any of them coming from Mr. Welch, and that would include Mr. Fisher.
Well, let me ask Mr. Welch. You brought him down, did you not, to act as your assistant?
Mr. McCarthy, I will not discuss this further with you. You have sat within 6 feet of me and could have asked me about Fred Fisher. You have seen fit to bring it out, and if there is a God in heaven, it will do neither you nor your cause any good. I will not discuss it further. I will not ask Mr. Cohen any more witnesses. You, Mr. Chairman, may, if you will, call the next witness.
Okay, so there, perhaps one of the most famous lines of the 50s, frankly, political lines of the 50s. Have you no sense of decency, sir, at long last?
It took several months, but the senators, including Republican senators, they had been slowly moving into stauncher opposition to McCarthy. Mm-hmm. And now this sort of episode, once again, they're all got a moist finger in the wind, right? They're all, what direction is the wind blowing?
Oh,
it
yeah,
looks like the wind is starting to blow against him. And so then some of them start to come out of the woodwork. Late in 1954, long story short, the U.S. Senate censures him. not censors, but censures.
Yeah.
Which is one of their, they've got their arcane rules. That's one of the things you can do to sort of
Bank somebody's
yeah,
hand.
to smack someone on the wrist. Exactly. So he censured. The vote was 67 to 22. So there were Republicans who voted against him, but there were Republicans who voted for him. John F. Kennedy infamously did not vote.
Yeah.
He could claim that he was sick, and partly what I read, Kennedy is in a bind because his dad was a big McCarthy supporter.
Yeah.
And Kennedy's a Democrat, and so it's like, what do you do? And so he just sort of it was not a moment of profiling courage, I would say.
No, it's sort of like the Eisenhower lack of courage.
Yeah, pretty much. And there was plenty of that going around in defense of Kennedy.
Okay, you mentioned a minute ago censured by the U.S. Senate. What does that mean? So what?
Yeah, so what does that mean? So basically, I mean, he doesn't lose any of his posts. He's not kicked out of the Senate. None of his privileges are taken away. It's basically the Senate saying, we disapprove of what you've done.
Right.
That's all it is. And in the Senate, it doesn't happen every day, so it's a big deal for them. The censure was symbolic of what happens next, which is far more important, and that is the fact that he was ostracized.
Yeah, okay.
That he was basically frozen out. He was never invited to the White House.
Mm-hmm.
Which most Republican in the White House.
Yeah,
Republican senators get
sure.
invited to events all the time. He doesn't get invited to the White House. When he rises to speak on the floor of the Senate, some senators leave or will sort of very obviously sit down and start reading the newspaper.
Wow.
And so the press starts to ignore him.
Perhaps the most important thing.
Yeah, I mean, that was the one thing stoking that fire is the press attention.
Yeah,
and now the press starts to ignore him. And if you read about his last years after 1954, it would really be quite sad and pathetic if he hadn't brought it on himself, if he didn't actually deserve this.
And been so really despicable.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, if it happened to anyone else, there's these pathetic stories of him like showing up to some public event like uninvited and then being like, but Senator, you really can't be here.
Yeah.
I mean, really super awkward stuff. And in one event I read about where he goes outside and he's found just sitting on the stoop sobbing.
Yeah.
I mean,
right.
It's amazing. And then what follows is basically his physical and emotional decline.
Yeah.
He had always been a heavy drinker. In this time period, he's also using morphine.
Now, this is technically a painkiller, but there's more to this story for him.
Yeah, there is. And also, by the way, it's not in my notes, but he was enabled in this by the head of the Narcotics Bureau, that guy, Harry Anslinger.
Wow.
Who basically made it so that McCarthy got his morphine.
Wow.
And kept it on the down low. Yeah.
Wow.
Not a good look for the big drug cop. He wasn't eating very much. He started to lose weight. And from all accounts, he's pretty clearly given up. I've read an account where he comes into his Senate office and he pours himself like a 12-ounce tumbler of straight scotch and says to his staff, the doctor says, this is going to kill me. And then he drains the glass. It's one of the clearest cases of sort of suicide by alcohol that I'm aware of, political history. He died in May 1957 at 48.
So the end of his second term.
Yeah. But I'm going to bust a mini myth because this is what I had always believed, because this was always in the official story, and this was in the press reports, that he had died of acute hepatitis, which at the time was often a euphemism for cirrhosis, right? Someone who's drunk themselves to death, you wouldn't say they died of cirrhosis, you say they died of acute hepatitis. And apparently that's not the case. Larry Ty has some of the medical receipts, and it seems what happened is that he was going through alcohol withdrawal. And alcohol withdrawal, apparently, when not managed properly, can cause death.
Oh, wow.
And in particular, it seems like it caused an enormous temperature spike, body temperature spike, like, I don't know, maybe 106, 108, which is something extraordinary.
Yeah.
It's high enough to kill
Dangerous,
you.
yeah.
Along with, he was having seizures and he was hallucinating. He had delirium tremens. Alcohol withdrawal, apparently, alcohol withdrawal symptoms led to the deaths of 1 patient in 3 back in the day.
That's a huge number.
So apparently these days he would have had a much better chance of surviving alcohol withdrawal than he did back then.
As we always ask with these shows where we had examined somebody in detail, what were his legacies? Why does he matter?
Right.
Show on
People should always be asking the so what question.
Yeah.
Joe McCarthy, who cares? As my students might say, Dr. Nash, that was way back then. Thank you for insulting my profession. Yeah. Anyway, the hard edge of the domestic Cold War was already starting to peak and continued to fade thereafter. The McCarthyite right, by the way, persisted. And this is also important, important in our context when we talk about things like, conspiracy mongers and the extreme right today. You had an extreme right back then in organizations like the John Birch Society, which already in the 50s accused Dwight Eisenhower of being a communist.
Yeah, that's amazing.
If that's not out there enough for you. So, and a lot of those people were McCarthyites. McCarthy still had a lot of support around the country and in Wisconsin, even when, at the time of his death and thereafter. Obviously, echoes of that sort of politics today. I would urge people not to over-personalize this. I said it a minute ago. I'll say it again. In some ways, the term McCarthyism is unfortunate.
Yeah.
Because it obviously lends itself to personalizing this, right? That this is about one guy. And if it weren't for him, maybe we wouldn't have the ism.
Okay, so we talked about this in the insurrection episode we had a couple of months ago. We say that we do this often to say, well, it's just this one outlier.
Right. Or you mean like with the lone wolf type?
Yeah,
argument.
the McCarthy, the lone wolf.
No,
yeah.
and then he is nothing without his context.
Right.
And if you didn't have McCarthy, you still would have had McCarthyism. You did have McCarthyism before him.
Yeah,
we just didn't call it that. So I would urge people not to get carried away with the fact that we use his name as a convenient label. Or to put it another way, McCarthyism is a lot more about us than it's about him.
Yes, that's very important point.
Yeah, even though, and in that sense, it's almost like an easy out. You can say, oh my God, look at that creep. Or, well, you talked about it in the other episodes too. Like, this isn't us.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, no, this is so you.
Yeah.
People after seeing how he operates, they vote for him.
Yeah.
That's on them. That's not on him.
Yeah, it was a totally enabling culture around him.
When you come across a car wreck like Joe McCarthy, your natural instinct is to distance yourself from him. My job as a historian is to close that distance when it's justified.
Right.
And that's true in this case. So there have been a few attempts to rehabilitate him. Some of them pretty ridiculous. And by the way, even if you look at like the Wikipedia article, there's some really unfortunate stuff in there on this subject, which I won't get into.
Yeah.
I'm usually a big fan of Wikipedia. It is true. A lot of his defenders or pseudo defenders say, well, the worst thing about him was that he gave anti-communism a bad name.
Mm-hmm.
That's true, and that's an important point. Anti-communism is a legitimate cause, and was a legitimate cause when done right. At certain points and in certain ways, communism was a threat. You don't have to go too far in that other direction. Anti-communism was a legitimate, necessary force. But McCarthy took it way too far, and he did do great damage to U.S. prestige and to U.S. lives in the darkest part of the Cold War. There's also a timing issue here, because you can find people try to rehabilitate him and say, well, look, there were communists in government.
Yeah.
And that's true.
Yeah.
And some that we found later that we didn't know were communists. But there's a timing issue. The threat of communists inside the United States and inside the United States government was a threat up until about 1950.
Yeah. Okay.
By that point, they have either been driven out of the country or are in prison or are no longer active. And so for him to come along in 1950 and 51 to say, I'm on hunting for communists, there's a reason why he really doesn't find any.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I've even seen, this may be a little too far, but there are people who claim that he didn't uncover a single real communist.
I believe that. Yeah. I certainly believe that.
So to say, well, the communism was a threat, was it a threat when he was doing what he was doing? The answer is basically no.
Yeah.
It wasn't. And even if it was, it didn't necessarily justify his method.
And even in the 40s and the 30s, it's a very, very small threat. It's
Correct.
not
Thank
like
you.
anywhere
Yes.
near
It was
what.
not a mass movement.
Yeah, at all in the United States.
For the record, the Communist Party USA, its membership peaked in 1932 at 100,000.
Yeah.
Which was a lot in the American context, but that was all about the Great Depression and about the Soviet Union allegedly being a superior model, blah, blah, blah. And its membership fades a lot after that. It fades a lot with things like, well, I don't know, the Nazi-Soviet Pact.
Yeah.
Which tends to give the Soviet Union a bad name.
The Communist Party shed members
the
after
roller
that.
coaster that communists have to ride because they're supposed to be loyal to the Soviet Union is
Ridiculous,
really unfortunate. In other words, and I mentioned it before, I'll mention it again, his crusade, if I can call it that, is not fundamentally about finding communists. It's about tarring liberals and Democrats as Reds for political gain. And I think that's a crucial distinction, right?
And despicable,
If the communist threat was truly large and truly dire, and he was actually damaging the communist cause for that reason, you might say, okay, yeah, he's got some rough edges, but we're going to give him a pass. But that's not what he's doing.
No.
He is the cutting edge of a Republican drive for power, and he's willing to demagogue his way and use the communism issue as the way of doing it. The other part of the lesson is demagogues remain a danger, as we've mentioned several times in this podcast. Demagogues remain a danger even in our own time. Things like scapegoating, baseless accusations, fear-mongering, these all pervade our right-wing media in particular. And I'm not going to both sides this because, what do they call it?
It's just not true.
Asymmetrical polarization. Emphasis on the asymmetrical.
Right.
Made much worse today by social media, I would argue. I can't imagine Joe McCarthy with Facebook and Twitter and TikTok at his disposal.
Lordy,
really don't want to go down that road. Lying still works in American politics. There's no question about that.
Absolutely.
The press is still timid and careless and easily manipulated. That's all still true. And so, I mean, I would argue, big picture, our democracy, while more open in some ways, is in some major ways more vulnerable than it was back in the early 1950s. And in that sense, I think Joe McCarthy is more relevant today than you might think.
Yes, more relevant. And the general McCarthyism, the general problems that we're seeing now are in many ways more frightening because, after all, you didn't have a January 6th in 1951.
Correct. Yeah. Joe McCarthy never tried to overturn the result of an election.
No. And his followers didn't storm the Capitol.
Yeah. So let's keep this in perspective. But still, I mean, he and his methods, that's not the distant past.
No.
And I really do think it benefits study.
Listen, Professor, while we're talking about this, I want to have a little man crush moment. We're putting the biography by Larry Tye on the Buzzkill bookshelf as our featured book for this episode. It's called Demagogue: The Life and Long Shadow of Senator Joseph McCarthy. And as you and I talk about a lot, there's some pretty bad and irresponsible and shallow and reactionary history written by journalists. And it's so refreshing when one comes to a book that is the absolute exception to that rule. This is a fantastic book. As you've noted, he's dug in. That is Larry Tye, and Larry, I hope you're listening. He dug up some brand new stuff on this. So that almost never happens at the journalistic level. I'm sorry, I don't mean to put John Meacham and other people in this category, but there's so much journalistic garbage out there when it comes to history. It's so great when this comes along. Right.
And also, and part of it is because he's not alone. There are some journalists who do good history. And what's also nice about it is journalists also typically are very good writers.
Yes.
Which I wish I could say about academic historians. And you know, and I know that that's often not the case.
This book, I swear to you, Buzzkillers, is, I'm going through the notes here now. This book is 500 pages long of text. And it is unputdownable.
Yes, it's very, very good. And let me just, because we were talking about this off mic, because I want to hammer this point home too as well. So not only is it well written, he's also done his homework, which is really important.
Yeah.
There are, I can think of at least a half dozen existing Joe McCarthy biographies. Some of them quite good. David Oshinsky's, and it's called A Conspiracy So Immense. I highly recommend that book as well if you really want to get into the McCarthy business. And after reading something like Oshinsky, I think, wow, it's got to be a great challenge to do another big fat McCarthy biography and have something new to say.
Yeah.
Well, not only does this have something new to say, this relies on a lot of new evidence. And that's one of the big surprises for me, right? I thought maybe this would just be a reinterpretation, maybe heavily based on existing sources. Larry Tye has done a lot of digging and come up with a lot of new information. For example, we never had access to the minutes of the executive sessions of McCarthy's permanent subcommittee on investigations.
Right.
So we don't know the blow by blow of what happened in those meetings and what they were like. Larry Tye writes about them because he got access to those.
Yeah.
Something that Oshinsky did not have access to. Other things like about his medical records, his military records, a lot of this stuff is new and we didn't have before. And so we get a much more accurate, much fuller picture. Doesn't mean the earlier books were bad necessarily.
No.
By the way, there was also some heavily partisan defenses of McCarthy out there, which you should stay away from. There is something new to say, and it reinforces the point that you and I talk about all the time, which is history is not static.
No.
We rewrite it all the time. We learn new things all the time.
New things come to light.
New things come to light.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm at pains to say this partly as someone who writes about the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
Which I mean, you can really make the case, my God, another Cuban Missile Crisis book? Yes, another Cuban Missile Crisis book, because there's always something new to say. There's always new evidence, new interpretation. History is constantly changing. It's an argument without end, as someone once said.
Well, we can say that Larry Tye writes this very, very well, but also it's important to say and to shout from the mountaintops that he analyzes this material very well. It isn't just well written, it is well analyzed.
Yes, it's not just a narrative, correct.
Yeah, so that's on the Buzzkill bookshelf. Please get it. It's long, but it is absolutely worth it.
I highly recommend it.
Particularly if you think of the long shadow part of his subtitle.
Yep.
It's very, very important.
Yes, he's writing this knowing what time he's writing in.
Yes, that's right. So, Buzzkillers, we hope you found this episode illuminating and McCarthy is not being forgotten in the 21st century. So it just remains for me to say thanks, Professor Nash, for coming on the show.
Always a pleasure.
And we will talk to all of you out there next week.